The first time the truth slipped out, it wasn't in a courtroom. It wasn't in a press conference. It wasn't even in an official report. It was in a whisper passed from one cell to another inside one of the most isolated prisons in America. A place where concrete, steel, and silence were supposed to keep secrets buried forever. According to later court filings and investigative reports, what inmates were whispering about was something almost unbelievable, that fights inside Pelican Bay State Prison weren't always spontaneous. Some were encouraged, some were arranged, and some, according to testimony, were watched by guards who did nothing to stop them. Pelican Bay sits in the far northern corner of California, near the Oregon border, surrounded by redwood forests, fog, and miles of empty road. It was designed to be remote on purpose. Opened in 1989, it was built to house the state's most dangerous prisoners, many of them locked inside the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, under near-total isolation. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation records, inmates in the SHU could spend up to 22 and sometimes 23 hours a day alone in concrete cells. No physical contact, minimal human interaction. A system meant to control violence by eliminating opportunity. But according to later lawsuits and news investigations, violence didn't disappear at Pelican Bay. It changed shape. Before we go any further, if you want more deep-dive investigations like this, real stories backed by records, court documents, and credible reporting, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing these stories to light. Pelican Bay's reputation didn't come from a single riot or a single incident. It grew slowly, fed by lawsuits, inmate affidavits, internal investigations, and testimony from men who survived inside its walls. One of the most disturbing allegations to emerge in the late 1990s and early 2000s was that certain correctional officers deliberately set the stage for inmate-on-inmate violence. Not by handing out weapons or giving direct orders, but by manipulating movement, timing, and known rivalries. According to federal court documents filed in the case of Madrid versus Gomez and later civil rights lawsuits, inmates alleged that guards sometimes released known enemies into the same yard space at the same time. Small yards, enclosed yards, no easy escape. These encounters, inmates claimed, were predictable. Guards knew which men were affiliated with which groups. They knew the tensions. They knew the outcomes were likely to be violent. One former inmate, identified only through court records and later interviews as a composite witness, described it as feeling like being pushed onto a battlefield with no armor. According to his sworn declaration, officers would open cell doors, stand back, and wait. The fight would erupt within seconds. When it was over, the survivors were cuffed, dragged away, and written up for disciplinary violations. The officers, he claimed, walked away untouched. These allegations weren't rumors pulled from thin air. In 2000, a federal jury in San Francisco heard testimony that Pelican Bay guards had, in some cases, failed to intervene during violent encounters they allegedly could have prevented. According to news reports covering the trial, the term Gladiator fights emerged from the idea that inmates were being forced into violent confrontations for the control or entertainment of others. The state denied systemic wrongdoing, and not all claims were upheld. But some cases resulted in settlements, policy changes, and disciplinary reviews. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to understand Pelican Bay's environment. The prison was built around control, not rehabilitation. Its SHU was modeled after military and Supermax designs, emphasizing isolation as a management tool. According to correctional policy documents, inmates assigned to the SHU were often labeled as gang leaders, shot callers, or individuals considered too disruptive or dangerous for general population. Once inside, they lived in near silence, their lives reduced to routine. For many, the only time they saw another inmate face-to-face was during controlled movement or brief exercise periods. Exercise yards were small, sometimes described in records as concrete boxes with mesh ceilings. According to inmate declarations, these yards became pressure cookers. Tension built over weeks, months, sometimes years. When rival inmates were placed together, violence was almost inevitable. The question raised by investigators wasn't whether violence occurred. That was never in dispute. The question was whether some officers knowingly allowed it, or worse, orchestrated it. One of the most cited incidents involved an inmate who was released into a yard with a known enemy from a rival racial group. According to his lawsuit, guards were aware of the risk. The inmate claimed he warned them. The fight broke out almost immediately. He was stabbed multiple times with an improvised weapon. According to medical records referenced in court filings, his injuries were severe but not fatal. The guards reported the incident as spontaneous inmate violence, but patterns began to emerge. According to investigative journalists who reviewed dozens of incident reports, similar scenarios repeated themselves. Same yards, same timing, same types of inmates. Guards stationed close enough to see, but not intervene until the damage was done. Civil rights attorneys argued that this wasn't negligence. It was deliberate indifference or worse. The state's response was firm. Officials denied that gladiator fights were sanctioned or encouraged. They argued that managing violent inmates in extreme conditions inevitably involved risk. According to official statements, guards were trained to intervene only when safe to do so, and split-second decisions could mean life or death. Some officers testified that entering a fight too quickly could endanger staff and escalate the situation. Still, the lawsuits continued, and so did the stories. Inside Pelican Bay, rumors traveled faster than official notices. Men learned who not to trust. They learned which guards to avoid. According to inmate interviews published by advocacy groups and later referenced in media coverage, some prisoners believed certain officers enjoyed watching fights unfold. Others believed the violence served a purpose, breaking down inmates psychologically, reinforcing control through fear. Not every claim was verified. Some were disputed. Some were dismissed by courts for lack of evidence. But enough survived legal scrutiny to force change. According to court order reforms and CDCR policy updates, Pelican Bay was required to revise yard procedures, improve oversight, and limit the mixing of known enemies. External monitors were brought in. Training was reviewed. Documentation became stricter. Yet the damage had already been done. For inmates who lived through it, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a system that taught them a brutal lesson. Survival depended not just on avoiding other inmates, but on navigating the power dynamics of the guards themselves. According to psychological evaluations cited in later reports, prolonged exposure to this environment led to hypervigilance, paranoia, and deep mistrust of authority. The public didn't fully grasp what was happening until years later. When hunger strikes erupted in 2011 and again in 2013, Pelican Bay became a national symbol of extreme incarceration. Inmates protested long-term solitary confinement, alleging it amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. According to coverage by major news outlets, thousands of prisoners across California joined in solidarity. Hidden beneath those protests was another layer of grievance, the belief that violence inside Pelican Bay had been used as a management tool. By the time journalists and civil rights groups began piecing together the full picture, many of the men who had first-hand knowledge were gone, transferred, released, or dead. What remained were documents, depositions, medical records, and a question that still haunts the prison's legacy. We go deeper inside Pelican Bay's SHU, into the daily routines, the coded rules, and the invisible lines that determined who lived, who bled, and who was left alone in a concrete box to think about what survival really meant. By the time the lawsuits began stacking up in federal court, Pelican Bay had already mastered silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the engineered quiet of isolation. According to California Department of Corrections records, the security housing unit was designed to strip away sound, movement, and contact. Thick concrete walls absorb voices. Steel doors seal men into cells the size of bathrooms. Even footsteps echoed differently here, muffled, distorted, as if the building itself was listening. Inside this environment, violence didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, deliberately, and often without witnesses willing to speak. Former inmates would later tell investigators that life in the SHU followed a rhythm that never appeared in official manuals. Days blurred together, broken only by counts, food slots opening, and the short walk to a concrete exercise yard. The yards were not open spaces. According to court filings, many were no larger than a parking space, enclosed by high walls and metal grates overhead, allowing only a strip of sky to show through. These yards were where tension lived. Men arrived there already carrying years of history. Gang affiliations, racial divisions, past assaults, old debts. According to validated gang intelligence reports cited in lawsuits, prison officials were well aware of these dynamics. Files existed. Charts existed. Lists existed. Everyone knew who could not safely be placed together. And yet, according to multiple sworn declarations, it happened anyway. One former inmate, referenced under a pseudonym in court documents, described the moment his cell door opened for yard release. He noticed immediately who was standing across from him. A man he had been told never to share space with. A man tied to a rival group. According to his testimony, he froze and spoke up. He told the officer there was a mistake. The officer didn't respond. The door slid open fully. Seconds later, the fight began. According to medical records later submitted as evidence, the inmate suffered multiple stab wounds from a weapon fashioned out of prison-issued materials. The injuries were serious but survivable. He was charged with disciplinary violations for participating in violence. The other inmate received the same charges. The officers involved reported the incident as spontaneous. But this wasn't an isolated account. Attorneys representing prisoners began noticing patterns. Similar incidents, same yards, same officers, same explanations. According to investigative reporting published years later, civil rights lawyers started referring to internal logs as copy and paste violence. Different dates, different inmates, same story. The question that haunted these cases wasn't whether inmates fought. That was expected in any high-security prison. The question was whether the conditions for those fights were being intentionally created. According to testimony from former guards, some officers believed fear was an effective management tool. This claim remains disputed, but it appears repeatedly in depositions. The idea was simple. Inmates who were afraid of unpredictable violence would be easier to control. They would follow rules. They would keep quiet. They would isolate themselves. The SHU made this easier. Inmates confined there had almost no external oversight. Family visits were rare. Legal visits were tightly controlled. According to advocacy reports, some inmates went months without meaningful human interaction. Complaints filed through internal grievance systems often took weeks or months to process, if they were addressed at all. Inside this vacuum, rumor became reality. Men learned to read signs most people never notice. The way an officer lingered near a control panel. The order in which cell doors opened. The timing of yard releases. According to inmate affidavits, these details determined whether a man walked back to his cell or left the yard bleeding. One former prisoner described it as psychological warfare. You never knew if today was the day your enemy would be placed next to you. You never knew if the guard watching would step in or stand back. According to his account, the uncertainty was worse than the fights themselves. Fear became constant. The legal system moved slowly, but it did move. In Madrid versus Gomez, a landmark case decided in 1995, a federal judge ruled that certain conditions at Pelican Bay violated constitutional standards, particularly regarding mentally ill inmates in the SHU. While the ruling did not directly declare Gladiator fights as policy, it acknowledged a culture of excessive force and inadequate safeguards. That ruling opened the door. Subsequent lawsuits built on the foundation. Attorneys argued that even if no official policy existed, the repeated failure to prevent predictable violence amounted to deliberate indifference. According to legal standards, deliberate indifference doesn't require intent to harm. It requires knowledge of risk and failure to act. Documents showed officials knew the risks. Internal memos referenced prior incidents. Classification reports warned against mixing certain inmates. Medical logs documented recurring injuries tied to yard encounters. According to court exhibits, the information was there. Yet the fights continued. For correctional officers working inside Pelican Bay, the situation was not simple. Some officers testified that staffing shortages, outdated facilities, and fear for their own safety influenced their decisions. According to union statements cited in media reports, guards argued that stepping into a violent encounter without backup could be deadly. They claimed they followed protocol, intervening only when conditions allowed. Others disagreed. A former officer, speaking anonymously to a journalist years later, described a culture where some staff became desensitized. Violence became routine. Injuries became paperwork. According to his account, a few officers crossed a line, viewing fights as inevitable and sometimes even useful. Not everyone crossed that line. But in a system built on isolation and secrecy, it only took a few. Outside the prison, Pelican Bay's reputation grew darker. Advocacy groups published reports. Journalists requested records. Families of inmates demanded answers. According to news investigations, California officials began quietly reviewing procedures, adjusting yard schedules, and increasing documentation requirements. Inside, inmates noticed changes, but trust did not return. Even after policy updates, men reported feeling expendable. According to later interviews, many believed reforms were cosmetic. The structure remained. The isolation remained. The fear remained. One inmate described it as living inside a rumor that never ended. The psychological toll was profound. According to expert testimony cited in court proceedings, prolonged exposure to unpredictable violence combined with isolation can cause long-term trauma. Hypervigilance becomes permanent. Sleep becomes fragmented. Paranoia becomes rational. Some inmates began refusing yard time altogether, choosing confinement over risk. Others prepared for fights they hoped would never come. According to prison records, disciplinary incidents rose even as official violence statistics were disputed. And hovering over everything was the knowledge that most of what happened would never leave the walls. Pelican Bay was far from public view. Journalists rarely gained access. Video footage was limited. According to legal filings, surveillance cameras existed but did not cover every angle. Blind spots were common. Critical moments often occurred just out of frame. The truth lived in testimony. In sworn declarations, men described officers watching with arms crossed. Others described officers stepping away at the exact moment violence erupted. Some claims were contested. Some were corroborated. Courts sorted fact from allegation slowly, case by case. But even when cases settled, questions lingered. Why were known enemies repeatedly placed together? Why were warnings ignored? Why did similar incidents follow similar patterns? By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay had become a symbol not just of extreme incarceration, but of what happens when control replaces accountability. According to oversight reports, the prison's remote location and Supermax design insulated it from scrutiny for years. That insulation cracked, but it did not shatter. For the men inside, the damage was already done. Violence was no longer shocking. It was expected. Trust was no longer possible. It was dangerous. And this environment set the stage for what came next. Because when systems built on fear are challenged, they do not collapse quietly. They resist. They harden. And sometimes they retaliate. The pressure finally breaks into the open through hunger strikes, national attention, and a reckoning that forces Pelican Bay's darkest allegations into the public eye. The moment Pelican Bay's secrets reached beyond its walls, the prison reacted the way institutions under pressure often do, by tightening control. According to public records and reporting from major news outlets, the early 2000s marked a turning point. Lawsuits were no longer isolated. Journalists were no longer ignoring inmate testimony. Civil rights organizations were no longer working quietly behind the scenes. The stories of violence, isolation, and alleged guard misconduct were beginning to converge into something harder to dismiss. Inside the prison, that shift was felt immediately. Former inmates would later describe a change in atmosphere. Officers became more rigid. Movement became more restricted. According to sworn statements, yard schedules were altered with little explanation. Some inmates were transferred suddenly. Others were locked down for extended periods following minor incidents. The message, intentional or not, was clear. Scrutiny from the outside meant instability on the inside. But the pressure didn't come only from lawsuits. It came from the men who lived inside Pelican Bay's SHU, many of whom had spent a decade or more in near-total isolation. According to public reporting, by 2011, a group of inmates decided that silence was no longer an option. The hunger strike began quietly. On July 1, 2011, inmates in Pelican Bay's SHU refused meals. According to statements later confirmed by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, hundreds of prisoners participated. Within days, the strike spread to other prisons across the state. At its peak, more than 6,000 inmates were involved. The demands were specific and documented. End long-term solitary confinement. Improve conditions. Provide meaningful pathways out of the SHU. Address allegations of abuse and neglect. While the hunger strike focused publicly on solitary confinement, many participants believed it was also the only way to draw attention to years of unchecked violence and fear. According to interviews published by advocacy organizations, inmates felt they had exhausted every internal channel. Grievances went unanswered. Complaints disappeared. Lawsuits took years. Starvation was the last tool left. Pelican Bay responded with denial and containment. Officials stated publicly that inmates were being monitored medically and that the prison was operating within legal guidelines. According to news reports, administrators argued that SHU placements were necessary for safety and security, particularly for inmates affiliated with gangs. But the strike didn't fade. Families began holding rallies outside the prison gates. Attorneys filed emergency motions. Media coverage intensified. According to investigative journalists, hunger strikers were being watched closely by international human rights organizations, including the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, who had previously criticized long-term solitary confinement in U.S. prisons. Behind the scenes, documents later revealed that prison officials were struggling to maintain control. Medical staff were stretched thin. Force feeding was debated but largely avoided due to legal and ethical concerns. According to internal emails obtained through public records requests, administrators feared that a death would trigger a national scandal. Inside the SHU, the hunger strike exposed the psychological toll of Pelican Bay's regime more clearly than any lawsuit ever had. Men who had survived stabbings, isolation, and years of fear were now confronting something even more dangerous, their own bodies failing. According to medical affidavits, some inmates lost more than 30 pounds. Blood pressure dropped. Vision blurred. Weakness became constant. Yet the strike held. What surprised many observers was the level of coordination. According to court filings and investigative reporting, inmates across racial and gang lines participated together. Groups that had been enemies for decades agreed to a ceasefire. This unity challenged one of the core assumptions behind SHU confinement, that isolation was necessary to prevent coordinated violence. If men could organize a peaceful protest across multiple facilities, critics asked, what exactly was isolation preventing? As pressure mounted, California officials agreed to negotiations. According to public statements, some concessions were made. Food was restored. Limited changes were promised. But for many inmates, the response felt superficial. 2 years later, the hunger strike returned. In July 2013, an even larger strike began. This time, more than 30,000 inmates statewide were reported to have participated at various points. According to news coverage, Pelican Bay was again at the center. The demands remained largely the same, but the tone had shifted. This was no longer a request. It was a reckoning. During this period, long-buried allegations resurfaced with renewed force. Attorneys representing hunger strikers reintroduced claims about orchestrated violence, yard manipulation, and guard misconduct. While not all claims were directly linked to the hunger strike demands, they formed part of a broader narrative that Pelican Bay's culture had normalized abuse. According to depositions filed during this period, some inmates described incidents dating back more than a decade. Others spoke about retaliation for filing grievances or participating in earlier legal actions. These claims were contested, and some remain unproven, but their volume was impossible to ignore. Public opinion began to shift. Editorial boards questioned the ethics of indefinite isolation. Lawmakers called for hearings. According to legislative records, California began reevaluating its gang validation process, which had long been used to justify SHU placements. In 2015, the pressure finally produced structural change. California agreed to a landmark settlement in Ashker versus Governor of California. According to court documents, the settlement effectively ended indefinite solitary confinement in the SHU. Inmates previously held in isolation for decades were transferred to general population units or step-down programs. New policies limited SHU placement and required clearer evidence of serious misconduct. Pelican Bay's SHU, once the most feared unit in the state, was transformed. But transformation did not mean accountability. While policies changed, few officers faced discipline related to past allegations. According to reporting at the time, investigations into specific claims of orchestrated violence were limited. Records were incomplete. Witnesses were scattered. Time had erased many paper trails. For the men who survived inside Pelican Bay, the victory was partial. Some were released from isolation after 20 or even 30 years. Others had already suffered irreversible psychological harm. According to expert evaluations cited in court filings, long-term SHU confinement had left many inmates with symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and chronic anxiety. The alleged Gladiator fights, whether proven in every detail or not, became part of Pelican Bay's legacy. They symbolized a deeper truth about systems built without transparency. When oversight disappears, abuse finds space to grow. Pelican Bay was no longer invisible. But the cost of that visibility had been paid in blood, silence, and years stolen from human lives. As the SHU doors opened and inmates stepped into a changed prison system, a new question emerged. What happens after exposure? Does reform erase the past, or does the past linger inside walls that never forget? We examine Pelican Bay's legacy today, the unanswered questions that remain, and what this story reveals about power, punishment, and accountability inside America's most extreme prisons. Pelican Bay did not collapse under the weight of its revelations. It adapted. Like most powerful institutions, it survived by changing just enough to continue. When the security housing unit doors finally opened for men who had spent decades inside concrete cells, the moment was quiet. There were no cameras inside the unit, no speeches, no apologies. According to accounts later shared with journalists, some inmates hesitated before stepping out. Others froze. A few broke down. After years of isolation, freedom inside prison felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. For the outside world, the reforms marked progress. For the men who lived through Pelican Bay's darkest years, they marked survival. The official narrative framed the changes as evolution. California corrections leaders described new policies as evidence of a modernized system. According to public statements, the department emphasized safety, rehabilitation, and constitutional compliance. The word Gladiator never appeared in official summaries. The focus remained forward-looking. But legacy is not written by press releases. It is written by what people remember. Inside Pelican Bay, the architecture stayed the same. The yard still echoed. The fog still rolled in off the Pacific. The remoteness still isolated the prison from everyday scrutiny. According to oversight reports, while the SHU population dropped dramatically after 2015, the physical structure remained capable of extreme confinement if policies shifted again. That possibility lingered like a warning. Former inmates began speaking publicly in ways they never could before. Some testified before lawmakers. Others spoke to journalists or advocacy groups. Their stories varied in detail but shared common themes: fear, unpredictability, silence, and powerlessness. Many described the alleged orchestrated fights not as isolated incidents, but as part of a broader culture where human suffering became routine. Not all claims were identical. Some conflicted. Some were impossible to verify years later. But taken together, they painted a picture that refused to fade. According to legal scholars who analyzed the Pelican Bay litigation, the prison became a case study in how extreme control can backfire. Isolation intended to suppress violence instead concentrated it. Secrecy intended to protect security instead protected misconduct. The absence of accountability created space where harm could thrive without consequence. For correctional officers, the legacy was complicated. Many guards working at Pelican Bay never faced allegations of misconduct. Some testified that they were trapped in a system that demanded control at all costs. According to union statements and interviews, staffing shortages, poor training, and constant tension took a toll on officers as well. Burnout was common. Trauma was real. The line between enforcing rules and surviving the shift blurred daily. But complexity did not erase responsibility. Civil rights attorneys argued that systems, not just individuals, were on trial. And in that sense, Pelican Bay was convicted in the court of public conscience. Not by a single verdict, but by accumulation. Years of reports, years of lawsuits, years of whispered testimony finally assembled into a record too heavy to ignore. The prison's name became shorthand for extremes, for isolation, for the dangers of unchecked authority. Nationally, Pelican Bay influenced policy far beyond California. According to academic studies and legislative records, its lawsuits were cited in debates about solitary confinement across the United States. States reconsidered long-term isolation. Courts referenced Pelican Bay when evaluating Eighth Amendment claims. International human rights organizations pointed to it as evidence that democratic systems were not immune to abuse. And yet, Pelican Bay still operates. It still houses inmates deemed dangerous. It still relies on strict control. The difference now is oversight, cameras, documentation, legal exposure. According to recent CDCR reports, the prison functions under tighter scrutiny than at any point in its history. Whether that scrutiny will last is an open question. Former inmates often say the same thing when asked about justice. They don't talk about revenge. They talk about acknowledgement, about being believed, about the simple recognition that what happened to them mattered. Many will never receive compensation. Many cases were dismissed. Many witnesses died or disappeared before courts could hear their testimony. Time eroded evidence. Memory faded. Systems moved on. But stories remained. Pelican Bay's greatest legacy may not be reform. It may be warning. A warning about what happens when fear replaces accountability, when isolation replaces oversight, when power operates in darkness long enough to believe it is untouchable. The allegations of gladiator fights were never about spectacle. They were about control, about what happens when human beings are reduced to variables in a system designed to dominate rather than understand. Today, when new prisons are proposed, Pelican Bay is invoked quietly. When solitary confinement is debated, its name surfaces in footnotes and testimonies. When courts ask how far punishment can go before it becomes cruelty, Pelican Bay is part of the answer. The men who survived its worst years carry the legacy in ways policy never can. In their sleep patterns, in their reactions to silence, in their mistrust of closed doors. The institution survived. The system adjusted. But the cost was paid by human lives measured not only in injuries, but in years erased. Pelican Bay was built to contain danger. Instead, it revealed one of the most uncomfortable truths about punishment in America. When oversight disappears, the line between order and abuse does too. And once crossed, that line is never truly erased.